Welcome to Get the Dish, Scoop It Up. So, my name is Serene Greenway. I'm a family and consumer sciences extension educator with the University of Idaho, and I am based in Owyhee County. Scoop It Up is, as you can see by our photo, it's going to be an ice cream making lesson. So, join us for the ride. So, what we're going to be talking about today, just a bit of an overview, is that we're going to talk about the history of ice cream, some of the ingredients that really contribute to a science portion of it, and then equipment and methods for considerations. We should also be including nutrition. Everything is okay in our diet as long as we're not allergic or have an intolerance, but in moderation. So, we'll be covering that. We're going to talk about the safety of ice cream and then how are you going to store it and then how should you serve it? And then just with any type of food preparation that we're doing at home, is it going to save us money? And then we'll talk about, we're going to do a demonstration on ice cream making. So, just a little bit on the history of ice cream. The origins are actually tied to 200 BCE, and those are from Chinese records describing a mixture of milk and rice with snow. So you'll find that a lot of the history with ice cream, is it ice cream? Is it gelato? Is it a sorbet? A lot of this is really going to just depend on some of those key ingredients. And so after some records in China, we have ancient Persia where frozen desserts were flavored with syrups. Again, is that a sorbet? Is that ice cream? We're going to all call it all ice cream as these are frozen treats. In the Roman Empire, Emperor Nero is said to have mountain snow flavored with fruit and honey sent back to him. And then the spread to Europe in the 13th century, Marco Polo brought stories of frozen milk desserts from Asia back to his home country of Italy. And so between the 16th and 17th centuries, ice cream became popular in European courts, especially in France and England. And so, as we talk about the history of ice cream in America, how did it come here? Well, it was actually brought by European settlers in the 1700s, and by the 1800s, ice cream parlors opened in major cities across the states. And then Thomas Jefferson is credited with one of the earliest American ice cream recipes. So, there's your little fun trivia fact for your next gathering. But when we really talk about where did the popularity of this sweet treat come from? It came from, the device, the creation of a device, so an appliance, the hand crank churn. When that was invented, it really made ice cream more accessible. And then with refrigeration, it was able to have in mass production. It wasn't just in a timely factor. So, why would we want to make ice cream? Well, just as we consider any food preparation method that we do at home, a lot of times we want to know what is in our food. And a lot of times, too, it can allow us to control the ingredients that we are including. So, whether we have, just a desire to be really mindful of our food intake, whether we have an intolerance, whether we have an allergy, preparing things at home can help us control and limit some of these concerns. Another reason why we may want to do ice cream making is that it could save money. I always say could rather than will because it really depends. Are you making something that you have do you have a dairy cow at your location? Are you milking that dairy cow and you're accessing, the dairy component for free? Do you have local produce that you're including in it? Or are you maybe purchasing items? Because sometimes when, are you going a gourmet route? Ooh, with that, that can all increase price. And so that's why I say it could save, and that's across the board. And then another reason to want to make your own ice cream is that you can customize your food. So there are times that you can make something at home that you may not necessarily be able to purchase at a local retailer, which is great. So when we talk about ice cream, ingredients are key because they do contribute to the scientific makeup of what we end up with, that end product of ice cream. Because when we talk about a basic ice cream base, what we are discussing is we're discussing a milk, we're discussing a cream because of the fat content of a cream. We're including sugar and we're including, some of our ingredients like the salt that balances well with that sugar and our flavoring, and then the vanilla, which is a flavoring. But when we talk about a key foundational ice cream, it's going to be your milk, your sugar, your cream, and then any other additives to balance flavors and profiles. And so, what we are trying to do with ice cream is we are doing a mixture of air bubbles because when we are making ice cream, we're churning it. And so, those air bubbles are being formed through the ice cream making process, whether we're doing this by hand with those hand crank churns, whether we have an electric device. Or commercially, they have, appliances, little, very large appliances, but they're incorporating air bubbles to give us that creamy, that texture that we are seeking when we think of ice cream. And then we're mixing those ice crystals, so we're cooling that base as it's being formed. And then that sugar solution is working with the fat globules, hence that cream in the recipe, to form the texture that we're going to end up with. So these are key pieces that come from the key ingredients that we're using. So when we talk about, yes, you can do these things at home, please know that there's a combination of chemistry and food technology occurring when we talk about ice cream making. So the ingredients as well as that process that we're utilizing and the technique in that process is what's going to create the output product that we have of ice cream or sorbet or gelato. You name your sweet treat, but at the end of the day, it's all through this process of, cooling the mixture, mixing that mixture, and incorporating factors, and then the science makeup of the ingredients of the mixture. So the cream, the milk solids, the sugar, and the water, because that water is a part of the milk. And the cream as well. There's going to be a little water component, but all of those are a part of the factor. So when we consider additional ingredients, those are things that we can add, but we don't necessarily have to add. So additional ingredients would be in emulsifiers. You find those a lot of times commercially. Egg yolks, tempered egg yolks, stabilizers are really common commercially as well. So you can have some gums. So those are going to be thickeners and they're going to stabilize as well. So they're added to improve the texture and prevent ice crystal formation. So that freezer burn that we're not necessarily wanting to have. And then emulsifiers help blend fat and water to help create that smooth mouthfeel that we commonly associate with our ice cream. One thing that I really want to bring up is this summer I actually worked with an intern, our intern Briar, shout out to her. And so one thing that we did was we looked at commercial ice creams that were available from a local retailer in our region, and we compared the different ingredients that were listed. So you can see, a Tillamook, it has tarragon, it has guar gum. We have some pasteurized egg yolk, some of those emulsifiers and stabilizers that we just discussed. You can see that they had two different versions, so we were comparing those. You can see in the red button that they have mono and diglycerides. They have polysorbate 80. We have some carrageenan and we have some dextrose, which is going to be that another sugar component. You can see Breyers has tarragon. So we go through, and then on the last one, we have our homemade ice cream. And with that homemade, you can see we've got the heavy whipping cream, we've got whole milk, sugar, vanilla, and salt. That is the base recipe that we'll be doing today, but we're going to add one ingredient of pumpkin puree as we want it to be a pumpkin. So with ice cream making tools, you don't have to be extravagant. However, some of the things that you can do is you can have some mixing bowls, a whisk, or a hand mixer. If you don't have an appliance, these are recommendations for you to have on hand. You have measuring cups and spoons, rubber spatula. You can have a saucepan available for some of those recipes that may have you cooking your base or at least bringing it to a minimum temperature. And then a fine mesh sieve or a thermometer should be available. So, as I shared, it does not have to be extreme in order to make ice cream. So, there are ways to make ice cream by hand. If you've ever done ice cream in a bag, that is a very traditional method that you can do with youth and adults very easily with common items that you have around your home, a freezer grade gallon size bag, a freezer grade quart size bag, and then the actual ice cream base. You would not put an entire recipe in your quart size bag. It probably won't be sufficient. And then in addition to that base recipe, all you're going to need is some ice cream salt and some ice. That's if you're going to be doing that, by hand. Commercially available, there are ice cream makers. At the end here, we're actually going to look at an appliance, this countertop appliance that you can have that is electric. There are manual versions where you can be doing some of that work yourself. They're a little less common these days, but there are options available that can be more economical as well. But if you choose an ice cream maker, the whole goal is that it's going to be churning that base, so creating those air bubbles while it's cooling it as well. And then the whole process too is intended to prevent large ice crystals so that we have the great mouthfeel that we seek. Hand crank churn, again, these are available, but they're kind of harder to find, but when you do find them, they're very economical. So there's classic wooden bucket style, and that uses ice cream and salt, but you can also find some that are metal as well. There's compressor ice cream maker, and so that has a built-in freezer. There are very professional results. You'll find that what we have today is very similar to a compressor, but not to that commercial level. And then the shaker ball is another piece of equipment where it's taking that ice cream in a bag theory and it's putting it into a canister into your shaker ball. So it's really easy for all ages and it's really similar. There are other options where I've seen that it's become really popular for stand mixers. So with a whisk or paddle attachment specific to the ice cream, and it also a lot of times can come with recipes, and those can be really easy options. There's also blender or food processor options that you have. A lot of times these are going to actually have you mixing your base and then placing it in the freezer. And so you can do fruits, nuts, banana based options. Those are some fun ones. If you have mix-in bowls, there's candy, fruit, cookie crumbles for you to fold in. There's some that you can find. You can do a pastry bag option for piping. Not necessary, but it can add that extra element if you're doing, a very special dinner with a special dessert. For no churn tools, like I shared, you have like baking dishes that you can use, or even like quick bread basins that you can freeze in. And so a lot of times you're freezing, you have to re-whip because again, you need to incorporate that air to give it that lightness. Those air bubbles are necessary. Otherwise, it's going to be really dense and it's not going to contribute to the mouthfeel we want. And then you refreeze again. So these are options that if you don't have or don't want to have one more appliance, you can do it at home. And then, as I already detailed, freezer ice cream in a bag with those freezer safe bags. Oops. And then when we consider nutrition, I think this is really key because a lot of times we think, oh, well, if I'm indulging, might as well go for it. But to be clear, we can indulge, but also be really mindful of our serving sizes. And I had a friend put together these nutrition facts for us to show the comparison between, a true serving size, which is half of a cup. You can see this on the right at 270 calories. But she created a 2/3 of a cup serving size because that is typically more realistic of what someone is going to be consuming, especially if we're at home and we're serving ourselves. And so to be mindful of those serving sizes, it can add 100 calories. It can have a difference in, how many carbohydrates you're consuming, all of those factors. And so when we are at home and we want to be mindful of the ingredients that we're putting into our bodies and we want to be mindful of the caloric intake, we can have that sweet treat. We can have it all the time as long as, our body is not having any adverse actions to it. But we want to be mindful that we can allow for that sweet treat. So everything in moderation. And so we should be only consuming half a cup. When we talk about making that ice cream at home, I view it for the opportunity, not maybe to save money, or I do like to control the ingredients. And I also like to add different produce to my ice cream. I think it can be a great way to incorporate my children into the process and have a fun time showing them that even sweet treats can have pizzazz and nutrition and be locally grown. So one thing that we will be viewing today is I'm going to be making my basic ice cream base that I shared is milk, sugar, heavy whipping cream, salt, and vanilla. And then I love adding in fruit. So I love to do an apple pie version where all I'm doing is really cooking down my apple, which I leave the peel on because I want as much fiber as possible. And I mix that in with some cinnamon. But another one that I really like, especially as we're in the fall right now, is pumpkin. And so I have pumpkins. I have some sugar pumpkins that I like to cook down, and then I use that meat, the pumpkin meat to put into my ice cream or other, soups and stews and whatnot. And so that makes a great add in because I grew them in my garden and I love showing my children that we can grow something and we can have it in all of these different forms. It can be sweet, it can be savory, and we have that on hand and we're not having to run to the store to get these sweet treats. But keep in mind, if you don't like pumpkin, maybe you're not going to do a pumpkin ice cream, right? So consider adjusting flavors based on your preference, but also where you're located and the season you're making it in. We're in the fall, it's not really a season for ice cream right now. However, I view it as an opportunity to make a seasonal treat. So the apple flavored, the pumpkin flavored, I've done acorn squash, butternut, and they're just as yummy to me because remember, my base already has sugar, and so I'm also incorporating some spices, some nutmeg, some cinnamon, some ginger. And so that is going to be incorporating a lot of that flavor profile that makes it a little more fall-esque than if I were doing something in the spring or summer. So keep that in mind that when we are doing ice cream making, it can be healthier, I guess, because remember, we are starting with that key base, high fat, high sugar, but we can also be including some health benefiting foods. So, getting some turmeric or ginger in there. I have absolutely done some different combinations that have been really fun. I've done basil in my ice cream, I've done spinach. And those are ways that, especially in the summer, I can incorporate local, available, and at the peak of ripeness foods. So, while we want to be mindful of costs and our nutrition, we also want to be very mindful of the safety of our ice cream. So sourcing those ingredients. Yes, we want to start with quality ingredients that we can afford, and then we also want to be mindful that we're handling it appropriately. Cream is something, milk is something that we need to keep those items cold. Cold food's cold, hot food's hot. And so we want to make sure that we're treating those appropriately, but at the top, we talked about emulsifiers and stabilizers, which we can add an egg yolk to our recipe, but we would want to be tempering that, meaning that we are heating that. And that would be a recommendation that we want to make sure that we're going to heat it and then immediately cool that and then maintain those colder temperatures. We don't want to leave things at room temperature. Luckily, ice cream will melt, so it becomes less desirable. But we also want to make sure that we're not just eating melted ice cream that may have been set on our counter and melted for a couple of hours because that could be a food safety risk. And then to store our ice cream, we do want it at 0 degrees. We want it to freeze. And then we also want to be mindful that when we are pulling it out of the freezer and we're handling it, maybe we want to bring it to room temperature for 10 minutes before serving, but we still don't want to be leaving it out at room temperature for hours on end, especially before serving. And then after serving, we want to return it to the freezer. As I just mentioned, a key component in very traditional recipes of ice cream include eggs. And so while that can be used, we want to be using it safely and appropriately. So there are food safety risks that can be tied to eggs because of salmonella. And so by pasteurizing those eggs that we are going to be using or tempering them, we are going to make them safe to use in our ice cream. And so what we are doing is we're using a cooked egg base where we're mixing the eggs and milk for a custard is what it's creating. So it's a custard base. And then we're cooking that to an internal temperature of 160 degrees Fahrenheit. And we are using a thermometer to ensure that we are reaching that temperature of that mixture. And then that temperature will ensure that if salmonella were present, it is destroyed because it cannot survive that temperature. And so we're using that food thermometer, and then we're also making sure that as soon as we have reached that, we're cooling that entire base down before we move on to our next step. Another thing to keep in mind is that when you are doing ice cream making, you want to practice food safety. It seems common sense, but in reality, we get going, especially if you are using eggs in your mixture, right? If you are following a traditional recipe, You're cracking those eggs, you're handling that. You want to be washing your hands, washing your surfaces, your utensils throughout that process. So keep your hands clean, ongoing, have soap and water available. And you want to be washing them for with warm water for at least 20 seconds. Dry with a paper towel or a clean cloth hand towel, and then keep your equipment and utensils clean throughout that process. And then before you even begin, you should have your surfaces sanitized. So storing that ice cream, as I shared, you want to be storing them in the freezer, not the refrigerator. It'll melt. And so with that, you want to make sure that you are selecting freezer safe containers. Just like I talked about making ice cream in a bag, freezer grade plastic bags to do that process. Or you want to make sure that your whatever you're storing them, the containers, that they are going to be graded for the freezer and you're not going to have breakage because you could, if something breaks, it could be breaking into your ice cream and that could be a safety concern. Storing that at 0 degrees Fahrenheit up to 6 months. Can you store ice cream longer? Yes, but the best recommendation is going to be up to 6 months because after that period of time, we can have some ice crystal formation. We can end up with some freezer burn. Is it unsafe? No, but the quality can be diminished, and so that's why we recommend that time frame. So as I shared, making ice cream at home can save money, but it really depends on what you have available to you. So, if you have a limited budget with no garden and you want to go a super gourmet route, I'm telling you, you might not be saving money in that. However, maybe you still have a limited budget, but you grow your own produce. You've got blackberries and strawberries and raspberries, and you're going to make a mixture out of those. You can save money versus buying that same product at the store that has those ingredients in it. Again, it just really depends on what you already have on hand and what you may need to be purchasing for the process. If you don't have an ice cream maker and you want that appliance, you're most likely going to be spending money before you're saving money in that long run. And so, with that, we're going to hit pause really quick because I'm going to shift and I'm going to do a demonstration of making pumpkin ice cream. And so what you will see here is the ice cream base, which you can find this handout, this recipe linked to this video here on YouTube. But the ice cream base is going to be 1.5 cups of heavy whipping cream, a pinch of salt, and then an optional mix-in, which I've shared with you today. The mix-in that we're going to be using is pumpkin. And then this recipe is also 3/4 of a cup of whole milk, 2/3 of a cup of granulated sugar, and a teaspoon of vanilla. And so what we do is we mix all of those ingredients, we mix them together, we are putting them in the refrigerator. We want it to be in the refrigerator 2 hours up to overnight. And that's because it's going to help it's going to help that sugar dissolve. It's going to help as that sugar dissolves, it's going to incorporate into all of our other ingredients like the milk, the cream, and any flavor profile that we've given it. And giving that mixture time to meld is really going to set up for a better, more obvious flavor profile. I can tell you from experience. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to pause. And in a moment, when I come back, I will show you that pre-made base going into the fridge. And then I'm going to show you a base that has been setting in the fridge that has the pumpkin incorporated in it, and that it's going to go into our ice cream maker. So stay tuned. Hi there. So I'm back. As I shared, we're going to go ahead and mix up the mix and then we'll get it into the fridge because we want to give it at least 2 hours, if not overnight, for those flavors to melt. So for this recipe, I have my pre-measured milk. I have 3/4 of a cup. It's just going into my bowl here. I then have 2/3 of a cup of my pre-measured granulated sugar. Now remember that sugar is playing a scientific factor, but may be a concern that you may have regarding your caloric intake. I'm going to do just a pinch of salt here. I like to just do a little pinch there. Remember, we don't need a lot. We're just using that to balance out our flavors. So we have our milk, we have our sugar, and we have that salt. I'm actually going to do a teaspoon of our vanilla here. It's going to be a nice flavor base profile there. I sometimes use an almond, because I love almond flavored anything. But it's not one that balances well with pumpkin, which is what I've selected for our fall themed ice cream flavor. So all I'm gonna do is just add those ingredients, give them a nice little mix. And now that those are incorporated, I'm going to go ahead and add my heavy whip, which is 1.5 cups of that. I'm just following that base recipe. I'm giving that a nice little mixture. But as I shared with you, I am using pumpkin today. So I grow sweet sugar pumpkins, and so those are great to bake. And then I use my pumpkin in my ice cream making. If you don't have pumpkins or you're not going to bake them, it's okay to purchase pumpkin puree and use that. Another one that is really nice, it's really mellow, is I like using acorn squash in that. So just another alternative if you're wanting to go with a fall theme and keep that local and seasonal produce in it. So I'm going to grab a little spoon. Like I said, you can just use pumpkin puree that you can purchase commercially. And that pumpkin puree, you just want to check your ingredients list on your labels, but because some of them can have other additives in them. The one I have is just a pumpkin puree, or what I traditionally do is make it at home. So I've added all of those ingredients, but what is fun about taking that base and doing mix-ins is that you can also mix in your spices. And so I actually like cinnamon. I like cinnamon. I like ginger. I like a few different flavors with that. My kiddos are not the biggest fans of all of the spices that I do. So I go ahead and I try to keep it simple. But cinnamon to start with, like half of a teaspoon of cinnamon for this base recipe with pumpkin is a nice start if you're wanting somewhere to get started. So I have mixed that up. Now remember, I just mixed this up, so I'm going to go ahead and put this in the fridge and give it 2 hours. We'll be back soon. Okay, with the magic of technology, we're fast forwarding here. And so here is a mixture of the base that I've taken. It has set for 2 hours in the fridge. Now that it has set, I can see that it's a nice mix, right? I don't feel the granular sugar because I've given it that time to set and meld. However, I'm still giving it a quick whisk because we do need these to be nice and mixed up. I don't want to leave anything on the bottom of my container before I'm then going to place in the canister of my ice cream maker. So here today, I'm using an appliance, an ice cream maker. I'm going to pour my base in. Hopefully you can see it as much as possible. I'm going to get that. And so this canister, it's a canister, and then it has the churn here that once I place it into the appliance, place it in place, I place my lid on. We're lucky that this specific appliance has settings that I can go ahead and I can power it on. I have a timer function where I can actually lower it to the timer that I need. For this appliance, it's going to be 40 minutes for this ice cream. And now I'm going to just hit start. And once I hit start, you can actually hear, because it is an appliance doing all of that work for us. Remember, it's churning. As it's churning, it's incorporating those air bubbles, but it's also freezing. It is essentially, a mini commercial version because it is freezing that mixture as it's churning all in one. So we're going to hear this in just a moment. And then I'll stop, and then we'll come back when the ice cream is done and you can see what it looks like, and we'll talk about storing that. All right, so as you can hear, the machine is still going. However, it is nearing the end. So I'm going to go ahead and hit stop. And I've got my little ice cream lover right here. He loves his pumpkin. He knows what we do with that pumpkin. We cook them down. And we use them in our ice cream making. So as I pull it out, you can actually see that those air bubbles with that churning, and has actually lifted that up, and it's pretty firm. It's hard to tell in the video, but this container is really cold, so cold that ice cream base is actually freezing around the edges. And so now that is as firm as I need it from the machine. So I'm going to power my machine off. And I am going to start scooping my ice cream into my containers. So for my ice cream, remember a serving size is half a cup, and that is more than we need for a sweet treat. So this is actually a half cup serving size, which is a perfect container. It's a freezer grade container for me to pre-measure out the servings. And so I have that pumpkin ice cream. It's still a little soft set. So if I wanted this to be a really firm consistency, all I would need to do is set it in the freezer for a couple of hours to firm up. So, yep, we've done acorn, squash, and we have done pumpkin. But with that, you're going to want to place these into your serving containers or into your storage containers that are freezer grade. You're going to place them in the freezer for up to 6 months. But remember to label, label, label. As I have my little ice cream eater here, he is not going to need a label. He is going to dig into his fall sweet treat. With that, check out the recipe below to make your own. Thank you and have a great day.